Lauren stepped into the apartment and felt her world stop. He was there in their bed with another woman. The walls they had painted together, the sheets they chose on a quiet Sunday morning, all of it surrounded the moment her 2-year relationship collapsed right in front of her eyes. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching it end, until her emotions shut down completely. Her best friend had only one answer for the pain: do something reckless. Hire a man for the night. Not for love, not even for intimacy, but to prove Lauren wasn't broken beyond repair. Blurred by wine and humiliation, she agreed. But when the hotel door finally opened, the man standing there was nothing like she imagined. And that unexpected meeting would change everything. Lauren Whitmore had always believed in commitment. She worked hard, kept her promises, and when she loved, she gave herself fully. That's how she loved Ryan for 2 years, openly, honestly, without holding anything back. She trusted him enough to accept the spare key he gave her 6 months in, helped him choose furniture for his place, and truly believed they were building a future together. At 28, Lauren was working as a marketing specialist at a mid-sized firm downtown. The job wasn't flashy, but it was steady, and she was good at it. Good enough that she'd just earned a promotion to senior account manager. The whole week, she'd been riding that success, already imagining how she and Ryan would celebrate. Their anniversary was coming up, and she'd been hinting about doing something meaningful. That Friday evening, she left work early with a bottle of wine and takeout from Ryan's favorite Italian restaurant. He told her he'd be home all night working, so she decided to surprise him. She still remembered the smile he gave her when he handed over the spare key, telling her she could come by any time. The building was quiet as she rode the elevator to the 4th floor, juggling food containers while unlocking the door. She pictured his reaction: dinner on the couch, bad TV, talking about her promotion and what it meant for them. The apartment was dim when she stepped inside, only a lamp glowing in the corner. She set the food down and called his name. No answer. Then she heard it. Voices. Soft. Intimate. A woman's laugh drifting from the bedroom. Her chest tightened. She tried to explain it away, telling herself it had to be nothing. But her feet moved on their own, down the hallway, to the door that was slightly open. She pushed it wider and saw everything. Ryan was on the bed with another woman, clothes half gone, tangled in the sheets Lauren had helped him choose just 3 months earlier. The same sheets she'd slept on so many times. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply stood there as Ryan scrambled up, panic flooding his face as he said her name, and Lauren felt the last pieces of what they had fall apart. The woman reached for the blanket, pulling it to her chest, her face burning with shock and something that looked a lot like guilt. Lauren's fingers went cold. The bag slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a soft, hollow sound. Ryan was still talking, words spilling out fast and frantic, but none of it reached her. All she could hear was the sharp ringing filling her ears. She turned and walked away. She didn't ask questions. She didn't wait for explanations. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and she made it to her car before the tears finally broke free. Sitting behind the wheel, hands clenched tight, her vision blurred as she fell apart in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since childhood. After a few minutes, she grabbed her phone and called Emma. Her best friend answered almost immediately. One word from Lauren was enough. Emma told her not to move. 20 minutes later, Emma found her in the parking lot and pulled her into the car, driving them to a small bar a few blocks away. They slid into a corner booth, and Lauren told her everything. Emma listened without interrupting, ordering drinks as Lauren's voice cracked through the story. By the 3rd glass of wine, the numbness faded into something sharper. Anger. Humiliation. Maybe both. Lauren couldn't tell anymore. Emma reached across the table, gripping her hand tightly, her expression blazing. She'd never trusted Ryan, and now she looked ready to drive back and confront him herself. Instead, she leaned closer and said something Lauren never expected. Emma told her there was a way to remind herself she wasn't weak. That she didn't need Ryan, his apologies, or his excuses. She could hire someone for the night, not for intimacy, not even for romance, just for the feeling of moving on. Just to prove she still mattered. Lauren laughed it off at first. It sounded ridiculous. But Emma kept talking, her voice calm and persuasive, and somewhere between the fourth and fifth drink, the idea didn't seem quite so insane anymore. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was the ache in her chest every time she replayed what she'd seen. Or maybe she just needed to do something, anything, that felt like taking control. Finally, she said yes. Emma made a few quiet phone calls, efficient and direct. Within an hour, she told Lauren everything was arranged. A room at the Grande Hotel. Someone would meet her there at 10. Lauren didn't ask questions. She didn't want details. She finished her drink, nodded, and tried not to think too hard about what she'd agreed to. Across the city, Andrew Cole was wrapping up a meeting that had dragged on 2 hours longer than planned. As CEO of Cole Industries, a multi-billion-dollar tech and investment company, he was used to long nights. Still, few people would recognize him outside a boardroom. Andrew preferred it that way. At 35, he'd built his company from nothing and learned early that privacy was priceless. He was also a single father. 3 years earlier, his wife had died in a car accident, leaving him to raise their daughter alone. Lily was 6 now, bright, stubborn, and the center of his world. No matter how busy work became, Andrew never missed bedtime or school events. Tonight was an exception. The meeting was unavoidable, and his assistant had promised everything was handled, a quiet room at the Grande Hotel where he could rest briefly before heading home. What she didn't realize was that she'd booked the wrong room and encoded the wrong key card. Andrew didn't notice. He was exhausted. When he arrived just after 10, he went to the floor he always used and slid the card into the door. It unlocked. The room was dim. A woman stood near the window, her back to him, gazing out at the city lights. Andrew froze, confusion setting in. He glanced down at the card, wondering if he'd made a mistake. Before he could speak, she turned around. Her eyes were red, her makeup smudged, and it was clear she'd been crying. She stared at him for a long second, then crossed the room and grabbed his arm. Lauren had been waiting nearly 20 minutes, nerves stretched tight. When the door finally opened and a man stepped inside, tall, dressed simply, looking worn but composed, she almost backed out. For just a moment, she questioned everything she'd agreed to. But it was already too late. Then Emma's voice echoed in her head, firm, encouraging, along with the image she couldn't erase of Ryan tangled up with someone else. Lauren forced herself to move. She stepped forward, reached for the man's arm, and gently guided him farther into the room. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt as she told him he didn't need to explain anything. Emma had already handled the payment. All Lauren needed was for him to stay. Andrew looked like he was about to protest, but she stopped him before he could speak. She couldn't handle questions or corrections. Not tonight. She just needed someone present, someone who wouldn't demand explanations. Andrew studied her for a moment, noticing the redness in her eyes, the slight shake in her hands. Something softened in his expression. Without arguing, he nodded and allowed her to lead him to the chair near the window. Lauren poured herself another drink from the bottle on the table and sat on the edge of the bed. She took a long swallow, feeling the warmth burn down her throat, and then the words spilled out. She told him about Ryan. About walking into the bedroom and seeing everything fall apart in an instant. About the 2 years she'd invested in something she thought was real, only to realize it hadn't been. The story came out fast and uneven, raw and unfiltered. She didn't stop herself. She wasn't trying to sound composed or dignified. She just needed the truth to exist somewhere outside her own mind. Andrew listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to comfort her with empty reassurances or offer solutions she hadn't asked for. He simply stayed where he was, relaxed but fully attentive, giving her his complete focus. When her voice finally broke and the words ran dry, he reached for the tissue box on the nightstand and handed one to her. Quietly, he told her she hadn't been wrong to trust someone, that the failure belonged to the person who didn't know how to protect what they had. Something cracked open in Lauren's chest. She didn't know this man. She didn't even know his name. Yet, sitting there in a hotel room with a stranger who was never meant to matter, she felt more understood than she had in months. She refilled her glass and took another slow sip. The wine dulled the sharp edges of the pain just enough for her to keep talking. She told him about the apartment she and Ryan had decorated together, the silly inside jokes, the way he used to text her every morning without fail. She admitted how deeply she'd believed it all meant something. Andrew remained in his seat, unhurried and open. He didn't check the time or glance at his phone. He stayed present, offering the occasional nod or quiet sound to let her know he was listening. Lauren wasn't used to that. With Ryan, she'd often felt like she was competing with the screen or the television for attention. This man, this stranger, made her feel like every word mattered. She offered him a drink. He declined with a polite shake of his head, his voice calm and steady. It was the kind of voice that asked for nothing and expected nothing in return. Without realizing it, Lauren began to relax. She had expected the night to feel awkward and transactional, something she'd regret by morning. Instead, it felt strangely normal. Safe. Eventually, the conversation shifted. Andrew began asking gentle questions, nothing invasive. He asked about her work, what she enjoyed about it, whether the promotion she'd mentioned earlier was something she'd been striving toward. Lauren answered easily, grateful for the distraction. She talked about her marketing job, the campaigns she loved, the clients who tested her patience, the small victories that made the long hours worthwhile. Andrew listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention. At some point, Lauren realized she was smiling just a little. The realization surprised her. She hadn't thought that was possible tonight. Curious now, she turned the conversation back to him. Lauren asked him what he did for work. For just a brief moment, something crossed Andrew's face, not discomfort exactly, more like calculation, before he answered that he worked in business. Investments, operations, things like that. He kept it intentionally broad, and Lauren didn't push. Everyone carried parts of their life they preferred to keep private. Then he mentioned his daughter. It was casual, almost an afterthought, but Lauren noticed the change immediately. His voice softened. He said she was 6 years old, bright, stubborn, and endlessly curious. He told her she kept him alert, kept him moving forward. That she was the reason he got up every morning, even on days when everything felt heavy or impossible. Lauren watched him as he spoke, the way his expression eased, the guarded edges falling away. Something tightened in her chest. The man sitting across from her didn't match the situation she thought she was in, and, before she could stop herself, the question slipped out. She asked how he could be there, in this room, knowing he had a daughter waiting at home. Andrew blinked, clearly caught off guard. Lauren immediately realized she'd crossed a line. She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the words lingered between them. He studied her quietly for a moment, as if weighing something, then chose not to answer and let the conversation move on. Lauren's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Ryan's name lit up the screen again. Another missed call. He'd been trying all night, leaving messages she hadn't listened to. She flipped the phone face down without a word. Andrew didn't comment, but she could feel his attention on her. She drained the last of her wine and set the glass down harder than intended, telling him she didn't want to talk about Ryan anymore. Andrew nodded and gently shifted topics, asking what she liked to do when she wasn't working. The question surprised her. She talked about books she loved, restaurants she'd been meaning to try, a coastal trip she'd planned months ago but never followed through on. Andrew mentioned places he'd traveled, cities he thought she might enjoy. For a while, it felt almost normal, like two strangers having an easy conversation somewhere ordinary. The wine kept flowing, though, and Lauren's emotions came in waves. One moment she was laughing, the next tears spilled over again. She apologized, embarrassed, but Andrew simply passed her another tissue and told her she didn't need to apologize for feeling anything. He said it so simply that something inside her loosened. She found herself studying him more closely. His clothes were simple, unflashy, but clearly well made. When his wrist caught the light, She noticed his watch, a Patek Philippe, the kind she'd only seen in magazines. She almost commented, then stopped. It didn't matter. His phone rang, the screen flashing with a message marked urgent, executive assistant. Andrew frowned briefly, then declined the call without explanation. Lauren raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She knew what late-night work emergencies felt like. Time blurred. Somewhere between her third and fourth glass of wine, Lauren talked about her family, growing up with two older brothers who still treated her like a kid. She talked about her first heartbreak in college, about a job offer in another city she almost accepted but didn't. Andrew listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions, never rushing her. Eventually, she asked about his daughter again. What it was like raising a child alone. This time, his expression changed completely. Shadows crossed his face as he told her his wife had died 3 years earlier in a sudden car accident. Lauren inhaled sharply and began to apologize, but Andrew shook his head. He said it was all right. He didn't mind talking about it. He told her his daughter had been too young to fully understand, and that he'd spent the last 3 years trying to be everything she needed, trying to make sure she never felt the absence too deeply. Lauren felt tears sting her eyes again, but these weren't for herself. She told him he sounded like a good father. Andrew smiled faintly, tired but sincere, and said he was doing his best. Some days were harder than others, but he wouldn't trade it for anything. She believed him. Then she told him about the future she'd imagined with Ryan, the house, the trips, the vague plans for marriage someday. She admitted how foolish it all felt now, like she'd been dreaming while he'd already checked out. Andrew shook his head. He told her she wasn't foolish. Wanting something didn't make her naive, he said. It made her human. Lauren didn't know how to respond. She sat there, studying the man across from her, a stranger by every definition, yet something subtle had shifted between them. It wasn't attraction. It was quieter than that. A sense of familiarity, of being understood without needing to explain herself. She wondered if he felt it too, or if it was just her own loneliness filling in the gaps. Eventually, the conversation drifted to lighter ground. Andrew told her about his daughter's school play, how she'd forgotten her lines and confidently launched into an improvised speech about dinosaurs instead. Lauren laughed, a real laugh that surprised her. For a moment, everything felt easy. Normal. She forgot about Ryan, the betrayal, the hotel room, and the impulsive plan Emma had talked her into. But the night kept moving. Lauren glanced at the clock and realized it was nearly 4 in the morning. The wine bottle sat empty on the table, and a dull ache had settled behind her eyes. Andrew checked his watch, his expression growing serious. He told her he needed to head out soon. His daughter would be waking up in a few hours, and he wanted to be there when she did. Someone was watching her for the night, but he never liked being away longer than necessary. Lauren nodded, suddenly aware of how surreal the evening had been. She'd spent hours talking, crying, and laughing with this man, and she didn't even know his last name. She stood, swaying slightly, and walked over to the desk where she'd left her purse. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her checkbook and wrote the amount Emma had told her, $5,000. She didn't question it. She just wanted to close the chapter cleanly, without complications. She tore out the check and turned toward Andrew, thanking him for staying, for listening, for treating her with kindness when she felt at her lowest. Andrew didn't reach for the check. He stared at it, then looked up at her, confusion creasing his brow. He asked why she was giving him money. Lauren froze. The question made no sense. She told him Emma had arranged everything, that the payment was part of the agreement. Andrew's confusion deepened. He asked what agreement she meant. A cold feeling settled in Lauren's stomach. She explained that Emma had hired him, that he was there because he'd been paid to be. Andrew shook his head slowly. And in that moment, Lauren saw the exact second he understood what she'd believed all night. He told her he hadn't been hired. He said he'd walked into the wrong room. His assistant had booked him on the 21st floor, but the key card had been programmed incorrectly. He'd ended up here by accident. Lauren stared at him, the check still clutched in her hand, as the room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She asked him to repeat that. Andrew did, his voice gentle but firm. He said he'd tried to explain when he first came in, but she'd been so upset, and he hadn't wanted to make things worse by correcting her. Lauren's face burned. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and cease to exist. She'd spent the entire night pouring her heart out to a man who had no idea why he was there, who'd stayed out of kindness or confusion, or maybe just pity. She shoved the check back into her purse and turned away, unable to look at him. She told him she was sorry, that she'd made a mistake, that he should just go. Andrew didn't move. He told her she didn't need to apologize. He said he was glad he'd been there, that he'd wanted to stay. Lauren didn't believe him, but she nodded anyway, still not turning around. She heard him move toward the door, heard him stop. He said her name, and she finally looked at him. He was pulling something out of his wallet, a small white card. He held it out to her and told her if she ever needed to talk, she could call him. Lauren took the card. It had his name, Andrew Cole, and a phone number. Nothing else, no title, no company name. She thanked him quietly, and Andrew gave her one last look, something warm and sad in his eyes before he let himself out. The door clicked shut, and Lauren stood alone in the middle of the hotel room, holding a business card from a man she'd never see again. She sank onto the bed and covered her face with her hands. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The whole night had been one long, humiliating disaster, and somehow it had also been the most honest conversation she'd had in months. She looked at the card again, turning it over in her fingers, and wondered if he'd meant it. If she called, would he even remember her? Or would this just be one more strange story he'd tell at parties someday about the drunk woman who mistook him for an escort? Lauren set the card on the nightstand and lay back on the bed. Her head was spinning, and her heart felt too heavy for her chest. She thought about Andrew, about the way he'd listened without judgment, the way he looked at her like she mattered. She thought about his daughter waiting for him at home, and felt a pang of something she couldn't name. She told herself she'd throw the card away in the morning. She told herself she'd forget this ever happened, but deep down she knew she wouldn't. Lauren woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a stomach full of regret. She checked out of the hotel as quickly as possible, avoiding eye contact with the front desk staff, and drove home in silence. The business card Andrew had given her sat in her purse, and every time she thought about it, her face burned with fresh humiliation. She'd made a complete fool of herself in front of a stranger, and worse, he'd been kind about it. She spent the weekend trying to forget. Emma called twice, asking how it went, but Lauren couldn't bring herself to explain what had actually happened. She told Emma everything was fine and left it at that. By Monday morning, she'd convinced herself she could move on. She threw herself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra projects, anything to keep her mind occupied. Ryan kept trying to reach her. He sent texts, left voicemails, even showed up at her apartment once. Lauren ignored all of it. She blocked his number, deleted his contact, and started the slow, painful process of untangling their lives. She packed up the things he'd left at her place and dropped them off with his doorman without a word. She unfollowed him on social media and asked their mutual friends not to mention him around her. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. 3 days after that night at the hotel, Lauren got a call from her boss. He asked her to come to his office right away, and the tone in his voice made her stomach drop. When she walked in, he was sitting behind his desk with a grim expression. He told her the company was being acquired. A larger firm had made an offer they couldn't refuse, and the transition would begin immediately. Most of the staff would be kept on, but there would be restructuring. Lauren would be moved to a new department, reporting directly to the acquiring company's executive team. Lauren asked which company. Her boss told her it was Coal Industries. The name didn't mean anything to her. She'd heard of it vaguely, knew it was some big tech and investment conglomerate, but that was all. Her boss explained that the CEO was notoriously private, rarely made public appearances, and ran the company with an iron grip. Lauren nodded along, already mentally preparing for the upheaval ahead. The following week, she received an email instructing her to report to Kohl Industries headquarters for an interview. The position was for a senior executive assistant supporting the CEO directly. It was a significant step up from her current role. And despite everything, Lauren felt a flicker of excitement. She needed this. She needed something good to happen, something that would prove she was moving forward and not just falling apart. She spent the night before the interview researching the company, trying to find anything she could about the CEO. There were almost no photos of him online. A few grainy shots from charity events always taken from a distance. The articles about Kohl Industries focused on the business itself, the acquisitions, the innovations. But Andrew Kohl himself remained a mystery. Lauren found that strange, but she supposed some people valued their privacy. On the morning of the interview, she dressed carefully, a tailored navy suit, modest heels, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wanted to look professional, confident, like someone who had her life together, even if she didn't feel that way. She arrived at the Kohl Industries building 15 minutes early and checked in with the receptionist who directed her to the top floor. The elevator ride felt endless. Lauren's heart was racing, and she couldn't tell if it was nerves or excitement or some combination of both. She stepped out into a sleek, modern hallway and followed the signs to the executive suite. A polished woman in her 40s greeted her and introduced herself as the outgoing assistant, explaining that she was being promoted to a different division. She led Lauren to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The woman told her the CEO would be with her shortly and left. Lauren sat down at the long table and tried to steady her breathing. She reviewed her notes one more time, rehearsing answers to questions she thought he might ask. She wanted this job. She needed it. It felt like the first real opportunity she'd had in a long time, and she wasn't going to let nerves ruin it. The door opened behind her. Lauren stood and turned, ready to introduce herself. The man walking into the room had his back to her, speaking quietly into his phone. He ended the call and turned around, and Lauren's entire body went cold. It was Andrew, the same man from the hotel, the same man who'd sat with her for hours while she cried and talked and made a complete fool of herself. Andrew stopped mid-step. His eyes widened just for a fraction of a second, and then his expression smoothed into something carefully neutral. Lauren couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Andrew Kohl, CEO of Kohl Industries, the man she'd tried to pay $5,000 for listening to her talk about her ex-boyfriend. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity. Lauren's hands were shaking, and she clasped them together to hide it. Andrew recovered first. He closed the door behind him and crossed to the table, his movements deliberate and controlled. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, her legs unsteady beneath her. He took the seat across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Andrew broke the silence. He asked if she was Lauren Whitmore, his voice formal and measured. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He glanced down at the folder in front of him, her resume and application materials, and then back up at her. He said they'd met before. It wasn't a question. Lauren swallowed hard and confirmed that yes, they had. Andrew leaned back in his chair, and something in his posture softened. He told her he wanted to make something clear. What had happened that night, the misunderstanding, the circumstances, none of it would affect his decision about this position. He said he'd reviewed her application before he knew who she was, and her qualifications were strong. She was here because she deserved to be, not because of anything else. Lauren's throat tightened. She managed to thank him, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. She told him she appreciated that and that she'd like to move forward professionally if possible. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable. He said that was what he wanted, too. Then he opened the folder and began asking her the standard interview questions. What were her strengths? What experience did she have managing complex schedules? How did she handle high-pressure situations? Lauren answered each question as best she could, trying to focus on the words and not on the surreal nature of the situation. Andrew listened carefully, occasionally making notes, his demeanor completely professional. It was almost easier this way, pretending they were strangers meeting for the first time. Almost. As the interview went on, Lauren started to relax just slightly. Andrew asked her about specific projects from her previous job, and she found herself falling into a rhythm, talking about campaigns she'd managed and problems she'd solved. He asked intelligent questions, the kind that showed he'd actually read her resume and understood what she'd accomplished. She started to remember why she'd wanted this job in the first place. Near the end of the interview, Andrew asked her why she wanted to work for coal industries. Lauren thought about it for a moment, then told him the truth. She said she wanted a challenge, something that would push her to grow. She said she was ready for a change, ready to prove to herself that she was capable of more than she'd been settling for. Andrew's expression shifted just slightly, and she thought she saw something like approval in his eyes. He closed the folder and stood. Lauren stood as well, her heart hammering in her chest. Andrew told her she had the job if she wanted it. Lauren blinked, surprised. She asked if he was sure, if he didn't need time to consider other candidates. Andrew shook his head. He said he'd already made his decision. Her qualifications spoke for themselves, and he believed she'd be an asset to the company. Lauren felt a rush of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy. She thanked him, trying to keep her voice steady, and told him she accepted. Andrew extended his hand, and she shook it, his grip firm and warm. He told her she could start the following Monday, and that his current assistant would help her transition into the role. Lauren nodded, still processing everything. Before she could turn to leave, Andrew spoke again. He said he wanted to address what had happened at the hotel just once so they could move past it. Lauren's stomach clenched, but she nodded. Andrew told her he didn't judge her for that night. He said everyone made decisions they regretted when they were hurting, and he respected the fact that she'd been honest with him, even if the circumstances had been unusual. Lauren felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She told him she was embarrassed, that she'd spent the last week wishing she could take it all back. Andrew's expression softened. He said she didn't need to be embarrassed. He said that night listening to her, it had reminded him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was just part of being human. And he was grateful for that reminder. Lauren didn't know what to say. She just stood there looking at this man who kept surprising her and felt something shift in her chest. She told him, "Thank you, not just for the job, but for that night, for staying when he could have left, for treating her with kindness when she'd been at her lowest." Andrew told her she didn't need to thank him. He said he'd meant what he'd told her then. She wasn't wrong for trusting someone. She was just unlucky in who she'd chosen to trust. Lauren nodded, her throat tight. She turned to leave, her hand on the door, and then stopped. She looked back at Andrew, who was watching her with that same quiet intensity she remembered from the hotel. She told him she was glad they'd met again, that she hadn't expected it, but she was glad. Andrew smiled just slightly and told her he was too. She left the office and made it all the way to the elevator before she let herself breathe. Her hands were still shaking, but this time it wasn't from nerves. The feeling in her chest wasn't fear anymore. It was something quieter, harder to name. Lauren thought about the business card she'd left at home, tucked away instead of thrown out like she'd promised herself. She thought about Andrew's daughter, about the way his expression softened every time he spoke about her. She remembered the steadiness in his gaze when he told Lauren she deserved more. The elevator door slid open, and Lauren stepped inside. As it descended, she caught her reflection in the brushed metal walls. She looked different somehow, calmer, more grounded, like she was finally beginning to regain her balance. She didn't know what the future would look like. She had no idea whether working under Andrew would be complicated, simple, or something in between. But for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was moving forward instead of running from the wreckage behind her. When she stepped onto the street, the afternoon sun felt warm against her skin. Lauren pulled out her phone and called Emma. Her friend answered immediately, demanding an update on the interview. Lauren laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh, and told her she'd gotten the job. Emma's cheer was so loud that Lauren had to pull the phone away from her ear. She didn't mention Andrew. Not yet. That story wasn't ready to be told. She was still trying to understand it herself. Instead, she listened to Emma's excitement and let the weight of the past few weeks ease, just a little. She'd been betrayed. She'd made impulsive choices. She'd cried in front of a stranger and offered him money for something he'd never agreed to. And somehow, impossibly, that stranger had become something else entirely. Not a savior. Not a solution. Just someone who had seen her at her lowest and hadn't turned away. And now he was her boss. Lauren shook her head softly at the absurdity of it all. A week ago, she never would have believed this was where she'd end up. But standing there on the sidewalk, phone to her ear, sunlight warming her face, she understood something clearly for the first time. Maybe this wasn't an ending at all.